if you go to China, you'll never, ever see the world in the same way again. Never.
What made you decide, I'm going to become this person who just goes to China a lot, studies it, understands it, tries to figure it out?
China doesn't, in the first instance, think of itself as a nation. It thinks of itself as a civilization.
Lifting 250 million people out of poverty, highways and roads that are much better than anything in Europe, much faster, trains that, go at speeds that are almost as fast as aeroplanes.
And from that moment, my life was different. I got back to England. I didn't want to think again about the West. I thought, I'll park that.
As a very smart, efficient nation and government, you surely see a more intelligent way to deal with this problem than repression. And you don't seem to be letting up.
My question was about Xinjiang. And the only question that was never replied to was my question. They call the 19th century the century of humiliation. The colonial powers won the rights to use the rivers and basically take whatever they wanted to take. Yes, I saw you. You were running. Only a white man would do something as stupid as that. So,
hey all, this is just a quick note to tell you that the interview that you're about to see with Martin Jacques on how China is rising was filmed before the US and Israel struck Iran on February 28th. As a result, no references to the war is made in the interview, but retrospectively, what I can say, as you will see, is that Martin's argument that the West and the USA are quickly falling very far behind China probably just makes more sense right now and is even stronger. Enjoy the interview.
Must have been some intuition that the colour today is blue.
Yeah, no, it's great minds.
That's a good cup of tea. But unfortunately, next time I drink it, it'll be pretty cold.
Clapping. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq Carim, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the studio Martin Jacques. Martin, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Martin, if you're not familiar with his work, he's a scholar of many things. He's a political commentator, a journalist, an analyst. But for the last few decades, he's been studying and understanding and learning and communicating to the rest of the world who and what China is. About 17 years ago, he wrote a book, When China Rules the World, which has sold over 1 million copies. You're currently deep in the weeds with a second book on China. I don't know if it's the second, but your second sort of big book on China.
Yeah.
You've probably written many things on China, which will come out in 2027. Martin, you on the show today mainly, I think, to do what you normally do, which is to explain to people outside of China how they misunderstand China and how they need to rethink what China is and how China is emerging, or emerged, quite frankly, already as a global leader. I'm going to start the interview in a different way, right? In the sense that before we actually go through China's history and what we don't understand it, normally I'll ask a takeaway at the end of the interview. But if there's someone listening to this, what is the takeaways you would like them to get from this interview?
Well, China is already a great power. You can't understand it through a Western prism, and you should not expect to be able to understand it in those terms. I would argue that China is now probably the global leader, more important than the United States. And that process is going to continue, and we'll see a process of, I suppose, this cynicization of the world, as opposed to what we've experienced for a long time, which has been the westernization of the world. By which I don't mean that the rise of China will be any kind of replica of the Western era. I think it will be different in all sorts of ways. And that's what's going to be so interesting.
Okay, so I mean, I was going to ask more questions, but you say it's already the world leader. When you say that, in what way do you mean? Do you mean economically? Do you mean it's in terms of the impact it's having in the direction the world's taking? What specifically do you mean?
Well, it's already ever since 2014, China's had the largest economy in the world, overtook the United States, measured by GDP according to primary purchasing power. Now it's probably about 25% bigger than the United States. It is it is the number one manufacturing country in the world with a big lead. It is represented in all the new innovations in the economy. In fact, it's really now the engine of innovation, much more important than the United States. In terms of AI, it's probably already the leader in AI, or it's on a par with the United States. And in areas like robotics, even drugs now, I mean, China is becoming, a big innovator. Electric vehicles, you only have to look on the streets to see the rise of China. China's the leader in this area. So in terms of economic, yes. In terms of its trading relationships, I mean, it's a very, very big trading country. It's much larger than the United States. And that's very important because that means that China exists in the context of many different trading relationships all over the world, particularly with the global South.
Okay, I mean, we are going to discuss throughout the interview. We're gonna when we start the sort of the longer discussion, we're just kind of now trying to get an understanding of what the main issues will be. And we'll start with the history. We'll talk about how China has changed, the Cultural Revolution, the impact of colonialism on China, and I think that impacts how both the colonized world, the colonizers in the world think about China, and how the colonized world associates with China, and how the Chinese themselves think back about how they think about the world. We'll also talk about the sticky issues around China, human rights records, authoritarianism, all those kind of things. But just before we go there, when I hear what you just said, that China is leading economically, it's the biggest manufacturer. I mean, I think most people now who see the economy, see stats. I think the AI debate is something that's probably not settled, but everything else is kind of settled. Definitely, the biggest manufacturer, most trading partners, those kind of things. But the first pushback that comes in my mind is culturally, China seems a lot more insular than, or maybe it's just because I'm part of the English-speaking westernized world that I think this way. But it seems that the sort of the grip that the Western world has on the world culturally in terms of movies, art, language, that's going to take a long while for the Chinese to kind of. What's your response to that?
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, we've always got to remember, we've got to pinch ourselves and remember that China was more or less an unknown to the world, and certainly the Western world, until very, very recently. This is a very recent phenomenon, probably basically a phenomenon of this century, because in the 20th century, China was pretty invisible to most people, certainly in the way the West views things. And the leading edge of its transformation, as is true of all countries, rising countries, is economic. But the impact of other areas and development of other areas usually, I think, lags behind somewhat. And the problem for China is that it is in many ways very unknown. I mean, people don't know very much about Chinese history. And I think if people knew more about it, they'd be both fascinated and shocked by some of the problems that China has had historically. Likewise, in terms of, because the language is so different and it's so unfamiliar, it's very difficult language to learn, and so on. So, in a world where the lingua franca has for some time now been English, that makes China that little bit more inaccessible, I think. In terms of movies and so on, yes, I think it's obviously true that Hollywood's dominated this area for a long time, but Chinese movies are becoming increasingly, big sellers, as it were, in China and that area of the world, because we've always got to remember that, the sort of cynic area, if you like, which includes Japan and ASEAN and so on, is quite a large, has a large population in its own right. I mean, the ASEAN countries' population is about 700 million people. So So I think that this is definitely a slower process. I'll give you another example where this is where we're very unfamiliar with Chinese ways, if you like, and that is, the philosophy of China and where it comes from, and the great thinkers, the great sages like Confucius and so on. I mean, people have heard of Confucius. I mean, a lot of people have heard of Confucius, but I don't think their understanding of Confucius is very great, and it's not talked about in the same way as the Greeks and so on. But you can't. This is where it's very important. You can't understand the notion of the individual, the concept of the individual, the relationship of the individual towards society in China without having some knowledge of the historical tradition, because the roots of the Chinese attitude towards the individual and his or her relationship to society is very deep and long running. Now, people, for example, when they're talking about Chinese politics, they say, "Oh, the reason why the Chinese don't have enough freedom and so on is because of the communist regime and so on." In fact, and you could see this during the COVID era, the Chinese expect and believe in society and then believe in the state in a different kind of way to what happens in the West. So therefore, there's an expectation that the state will lead in a way that's opposite in the United States. People don't look to the state and are rather inimical to the state. And this is not so true in Europe, but it's partially true in Europe as well. So there's lots of ways in which, if we want to understand China in a deeper way, socially or culturally or so on, we've got to know something about Chinese history and Chinese thinking.
Okay, I want to ask you. You've kind of touched on it, on what we fundamentally don't understand about China. So I want to. That's the main question I want to ask you now. But before that, why? I mean, you've clearly been studying China for a long time. Where does the interest come from? What, were you just a child that was interested in China? Did it develop in your career? Like what made you decide, I'm going to become this person who just goes to China a lot, studies it, understands it, tries to figure it out?
Well, I'd say it's one of those kind of accidents in life that you at some point you change direction, and only later do you realize how fundamental it's been. I used to be a kind of writer and protagonist in the British political scene on the left, and I edited what for its time was a very influential and famous magazine called Marxism Today. But to be honest with you, our international coverage was poor. It was not so significant. It was a very Western-centric, above all British-centric magazine. I think while I was there, I only published one major article over 14 years on China. So that is that's a good illustration.
And you were there from, I think it was 77 to 91, right? So
yeah, exactly. Okay. Right, yeah. And and then when I closed the magazine, because I thought we'd just done all we could, and if I didn't want it to just peter out, I wanted it to go out all guns blazing, as it were. And then this is a very personal story. I'd never had any time, because Marxism Today was a killer time-wise, and I never had any money because it was we didn't have any money. So it was one hell of a slog, It was, and when I stopped, it was a bit better towards the end, because because I had acquired a certain amount of celebrity because of the success of the magazine, the influence of the magazine. So I got asked to write columns and television things and so on. So the last 3 or 4 years of it was financially easier. But anyway, when I finished, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, actually, to be honest. And I was trying this, that, the other, and then it so happened that I was thinking, where shall I go on holiday? And I was talking to a friend, and they said, "Oh, well, we just come back from Southeast Asia. You could I'd been to Japan in 1979 for a conference, and I was very fascinated by it. But basically, I was in a hotel room all the time in this conference. So I'd never been to this part of the world. So I went, and I mean, it wasn't, by today's standards, it wasn't very imaginative. But then I went to Hong Kong, southern China, Malaysia, and Singapore. I wouldn't recommend that choice now, but then it was incredible because I knew the figures, but seeing is believing, and I was really taken aback by the modernity of obviously Hong Kong particularly, and Singapore, and the question that was in my mind was, it's so modern, is it Western? In other words, is this just a sort of imitation or an adaptation, better way of putting it, of Western modernity, or is this something rather different? And at that time, this was an argument in intellectual circles, with the assumption that globalization was Westernization.
Yeah.
That
and
was the dominant mantra
of
of
Westernization. Yes.
yeah, in the 1990s, and I'd read one or two things before I left. Ezra Vogel's book, the Miracle of the Four Nations. I can't remember what it's called now, but it was for a beginner. It was a beginning book. It's a really good book, and so that was very important. And I remember this extraordinary sight when we were on a coach in Guangdong province, which is north of Hong Kong, and it was on either side of the road. It was extraordinary kind of snapshot of various historical eras existing alongside each other, and the water buffalo, farmers using with very little in the way of aids at all, people walking, people on all kinds of contraptions. This was a road in the middle of the countryside, but it was absolutely packed, and then occasionally you get this flashy Mercedes-Benz, because this was already the Reform period, go by, and I got this and as far as the eye could see, they'd clear the land, So it was an extraordinary moment. I used to be an historian, economic historian.
And this was in Hong Kong? Or?
This was in southern China.
Okay.
Southern China,
okay.
In Guangdong province, and which was became the leading province for the initial economic transformation of China. And I thought to myself, this is what the Industrial Revolution must have been like in Britain in the 1830s or 1840s and so on, or earlier. But this was on a scale which was completely different because it's so much later and China's so much bigger and so on. But I was absolutely fascinated by that, and so that was one. So I was absolutely gobsmacked by what I was seeing and feeling, and then on the last day of this holiday, I met. Well, I used to run every day, and so if I could, and when I was running, I didn't have the local vision back, and I saw this woman to the left, and as I ran back, and she smiled but everyone smiled at you in Malaysia, and I realised that. And anyway, I saw her later on at a. That's right. Yes, at a jungle trek. It so happened, and she was from behind. There was quite a few of us getting together, and she said, "Haven't I seen you somewhere before?" And I turned round and said, "Yes, I saw you. You were running. Only a white man would do something as stupid as that." So I thought, wow, who is this? And then she said, "Why did you come to Tiananmen?" she said, there's much better, much nicer islands than that. And I said, well, it's fat lot, you should tell me that. Anyway, we fell into the conversation, and within a quarter an hour, 20 minutes, I'd completely fallen in love with her. And we went on the junction, and I always knew where she was. And then, from that moment to even now, she has always been on my mind. And anyway, to cut a long story short, of course, here we have a double whammy. You know, I've got falling in love with. She was in Indian Malaysian, Punjabi background, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, this extraordinary intellectual, political experience of East Asia. And from that moment, my life was different. I got back to England. I didn't want to think again about the West. I thought, I'll park that. That is my history. I want to have a different. I'm going to take a different direction, which is exactly what happened. And
so have you seen this woman again, by the way, or not?
Well,
I know we're completely digressing from what we're supposed to speak about, but hey,
this is a wonderful and terrible story. What happened was it was very complicated having this relationship, but I was so entranced by her that I was determined to try and make it work. And she'd not travelled really at all. And anyway, I went to see her. I was actually doing an interview with Chris Patton in Hong Kong then for BBC programs I was doing, and I decided to go to KL and see her. She lived in KL, well, Petaling Jaya actually, and anyway, nothing happened. But after that, and I went back on the phone. You know, she said to me, I said, "How are you feeling?" I just thanked her for her hospitality, and she told me, "I'm missing you." And I knew at that moment that my feelings were her feelings. And she came to live in England in 1994 in September. And she, this is a hard story to tell you.
You don't have to if you don't want to.
And what happened was that, this was a phenomenal relationship, a brilliant relationship. Never had anything like it's like before and since. And she managed to get a job at a city law firm. She was a lawyer, and then they asked her if she'd like to go to. So they wanted to second her to Hong Kong, and so we lived in Hong Kong. And she had suffered a lot of racism in Hong Kong from the local Chinese, a lot. And she spoke fairly good conversational Cantonese because she was brought up in a Chinese area of Petaling Jaya. She was mildly epileptic on New Year's Eve. She at 1 o'clock in the morning, we were there. Do you remember Eric Hobsbawm, the historian?
No.
Yeah, well, they were staying with us. And she had an epileptic fit. It's only the second serious one she ever had. She was taken to the hospital. And she died in the hospital as a result of terrible negligence, in my view, because of racial prejudice. She was neglected. And she died on the 2nd of January, 2000.
I'm very sorry for your loss.
So you can see how East Asia opened up and developed my life in a completely different way. We've got a son, by the way. He's now 27, Ravi. So from that moment onwards, from that visit, my mind was absolutely consumed by this and by East Asia, and I tried to find any excuse I could to go, to write or to do a program or a holiday sometimes, and then Actually, I think it was Neil Ferguson. I'm quite a good friend, although we're politically very different. Neil said, "Why don't you write a book on you know so much about it, or you're so interested in it? Why don't you write a book?" And that's, that was the sort of I think, I'm not certain about this. I think that was probably that was planted the first time I remember thinking, yeah, that's an interesting idea. And that's what I did.
So this was, I guess, he planted this idea in your mind about 2004 or 5. Because the book came out in 2009.
No, earlier.
Much earlier.
Yeah, because I'd already I started work on the book. I think, when did I get the contract from? In the late 90s, I got a contract with Penguin, and then so going to Hong Kong made sense when Harry got the job, because I was obviously much more able to access the region than I had been previously.
Yes. Okay. So, coming back to my initials, thanks for sharing that, by the way. I know that's very difficult and personal. So when it comes to understanding China, what do you think we, the people in the West who consume Western media, who may even want to empathize with the global South, as opposed to people on the far right, etc., what do we fundamentally misunderstand about China?
Well, I think we expect China to be like us. We expect China to be Western. So we measure China by Western standards and Western values. And I understand that, because the West has been dominant in the world for so long. And the ideas we're presented with, all sorts of ways, are, Western ideas. But we came to assume that this enormous conflation, which was the West was really the world, and everything else was tagged on behind it. And what was happen as these countries took off was they would become like us. Well, that's a complete obviously not true. I mean, these countries have totally different histories and technologies and cultures and so on. So they're very, very different. So we, instead of moving more and more into Western modernization, actually what we're seeing, and this is what but I was puzzled with when I went to Hong Kong originally, what we're seeing is multiple modernities. This is not just true of China, it's true of India, it's true everywhere. In the Islamic world, it's going to be different, and it's going to remain different, and it's not going to be a copy of the West.
Okay. I mean, China is a very old civilization. It's been going on for many years, 5,000 years, if not longer. During large parts of that, they were, a very prosperous nation, key trading center of the world. If you had to explain to someone who's new to this, to someone who doesn't understand who China is, just up until the modern era, so up until about 1500, before colonialism and industrialization takes place, just what is the key components of China's history that make it what it is until that moment, until about the year 1500?
I think the most important thing to understand about China is that it's a very old civilization. I mean, the Chinese talk about 5,000 years of civilization. And for several phases in its history, it has been the most advanced or one of the most advanced countries in the world. So if you go back just to take the last 2,000 years, China was sort of unified in a fashion in 211 BC. And since then, during the part of the Han Dynasty, part of the Tang Dynasty, part of the Sung Dynasty, part of the Ming Dynasty, China was certainly, extraordinary, one of the most advanced, often the most advanced culture in the world. There is no other civilization that has had that kind of history, that they've come, that when they rise and decline, as China did, rise and decline, they don't rise again to become so influential and extraordinary by global measures. So I think what that speaks to is a kind of inner strength of the culture. Why? How? Well, it's had various threads to it. I mean, very deep belief in education and the importance of education. A very rich culture, a very rich literary culture over a very long historical period. From Confucius was around about the same time as the Greek philosophers, 2,500 years ago, and so on. That was before the unification of China, and others like Mencius and so on were very advanced philosophers for their time, different from the Western traditions, but very important. So I think that what you have here is the picture of not a country, but a civilization. It's very important, I think, for us to understand that China doesn't, in the first instance, think of itself as a nation. It thinks of itself as a civilization. After 211 BC, China didn't, or before that for that matter, when there was lots of Chinese states before unification, they thought of, they didn't have boundaries and borders. I mean, China didn't start developing borders really until the 19th century, the late 19th century, when because it was so badly harmed really by the European powers in particular, China hadn't drawn borders. It didn't have embassies and so on. So the whole way in which China existed was very different from what happened in the West, particularly from the Treaty of Westphalia, and then, of course, in the 19th century and so on, the rise of the nation state. That didn't happen. China was very different. China was a civilization. To this day, I argue that China is first and foremost a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. So this is now another feature of China is is how has it held together over such a long historical period? Because it's a huge country. It's not as big as it was actually during the Qing period, which was the sort of last dynasty, but it's still a very big country, which, population size is about 17% of the world's population. And somehow or other, China's held together as a whole for a very long historical period. Most of the population concentrated in the eastern part of China, and less in the central, and very little in the western part of China, where the conditions didn't lend themselves to economic rich agriculture, etc. So only about 6% of China live in the western part of the country. So I would say to people who don't know much about China, you've got to understand all this, because you've got to think about it in a different way to the experience in the West and the growth of a Western nation state. I mean, my view is one of the great strengths now in the world of China against a country like the United States is that it is a civilization state in the first instance, and only secondarily a nation state, and that gives the country a great sense, a great sense of affinity, a great sense of some great traditions. I mean, the state tradition in China is undoubtedly one of the most outstanding features of China. And the people believe in the state in a way that they don't, by and large, in Western societies, because we've got a very different tradition.
Okay. I think a big part of both our understanding of China and how China views the West. And this is, again, just my assumption. But obviously, it's the story of industrialization, colonialism, the Opium Wars, which we can go into, and then the post-World War II period, which is almost now two periods. The period of full-blown communism, Marxism under Mao, and then the Cultural Revolution, right? All of these things also are kind of, in a way, a lot of it's organic, but a lot of it's reactions to the West, right? So, I mean, you can go through this one by one as you like. You can maybe just talk about colonialism and then just talk about, or you can answer it generally as you prefer. And if I require, I'll answer more follow-ups, because it's a big question. But just how is that period, the period of 500 years of confronting the West as in a different way? Because I mean, the relations between China and Europe are old. It's because of trade routes and stuff like that. But in terms of, there's now this emerging power that is colonizing parts of the world and has colonial designs on China, and then meddles with it. And the Opium Wars is very destructive, and its first real, like really massively destructive part on Chinese society. And then there's the condescension which follows, which still exists. Fundamentally changes a proud civilization. Or maybe it doesn't change it, but it definitely creates stimuli, which makes it react differently. So how is that experience sort of impacted China, and how do you see them coming through that?
Well, it's had an enormous impact on China, and I think it was even more difficult for China to take, because it's a proud country, a proud culture, a great civilization. So to be reduced as it was by Europe, by Britain and France and lots of other countries joined in, was a terrible experience. But I think a crucial point here is that the reason why China was vulnerable to what happened with the Opium Wars, I mean, it really starts big time from the 1840s, was that China had failed to industrialize. And I mean, the strength of countries like Britain and France, both economically and therefore also militarily, was that they were industrial countries, and China was primarily still not an industrial country. It had bits and bobs, but so it was well behind, and it didn't realize how far it was behind. It was, it just couldn't come to terms, and so from that moment of the 1840s, the great challenge for China was, how do we recover from what's happened, and how do we modernize? And the great question of the 19th century facing Japan had the same kind of problem. How do we modernize? First of all, there's a need of recognition that Europe had modernized, and that was the source of its strength. And then there was the question of how do we transform ourselves, and this was a long struggle in China to find the conditions for modernization. And the great achievement, in my view, of the Chinese Communist Party in the first instance, well, one is to unify the country, but the second thing after 1949 was to falteringly begin the process of modernization in China. It doesn't start with Deng Xiaoping. It starts already with the Mao era. But there's a lot of mistakes made in that period, not surprisingly. And then from Deng onwards, of course, we all know this extraordinary story of dramatic economic growth from 1978, growing for 35 years at 10% a year. Fantastic, incredible. But I think that for China, the experience, they call the 19th century the century of humiliation. And it was, bits of China were colonized, mainly the advanced bits, which became treaty ports, so Beijing, Shanghai, and and the part of the nature of the colonization would be, there'd be a French concession, there'd be a British concession, and so on in these places. And they were the colonial powers won the rights to use the rivers and basically take whatever they wanted to take. So it wasn't like an African colonization, but it was. It had a hugely damaging effect, and the indemnities charged and the wars that were fought and so on, and so China was really, was on its knees, and so you got the fall of the imperial regime in 1911, and then after that you got a lot of you got a very difficult period of division in China, and you got the Japanese invasion from 1930 to 36 in northeast China, and then across most of China from 1939 to 45. So China, this was a very proud country, very aware. Every Chinese person in their different ways knows about this history and common law, as it were. And what they saw now was China, on its knees, basically. Hence Mao's 1949 speech on October the 1st was, we've got to stand up. China must stand up. And I think that there are a number of interesting threads from this, actually. China, China from especially the Reform period and Deng understood that it had to learn from the West. It couldn't, so there's a great learning phase, which was learning from the West. It starts. The first period, with Mao, they were linked with the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War and so on. And then the relationship broke down in the late 50s. And then China was very much kind of on its own. And it had very little contact with the West, really, relatively speaking. And then that began to change, really, with the 1972 visit of Nixon and Kissinger to see Mao and the Chinese leadership. And then there was a new that was the beginning of the end of the isolation of China and its incorporation progressively into the global economy. So I think that what China was never didn't react in well, it did have a negativity towards the West, obviously because of how the West had treated it, but it also understood that it had to learn. China had to learn from elsewhere. They're great learners, the Chinese are. That's one of the reasons why they've been so successful over a long period of history. And so I think that one of the advantages I think China's had as a colonial as a colony or having a colonial experience is that it still remained independent in a fashion. It was a semi-colony, not completely colonized. So that long history of traditions of the state and so on remained there. It wasn't ripped out. The civilizational tradition of China remained very much intact. Whereas I think one of the terrible things that's happened for a lot of countries of the global south is they've actually, the colonial experience and the post-colonial experience deprived them of a lot of their traditions. They've had to rediscover them. I don't think the Chinese had that problem in anything like the same way. I think the depth of it, of those traditions, the depth of the culture, the continuity of the culture, allowed China to be able to recuperate and then achieve extraordinary things later on.
Okay. So, you mentioned from 1978, 10 years of growth for 35 years. People sort of attributed that those all sort of started with the Cultural Revolution, which I think is about 91 or 92. I mean, it has been a great story. I mean, just in terms of, I mean, I mean, we will talk about what people say in the West say is the bad side, and I'm not giving a value judgment. We will deal with authoritarianism, possibly there's kind of like a monoculture movement under the Han sort of Chinese, which we'll get to later. But before that, what do you think? I mean, outside of the fact that there's this very rich nation traditionally, historically, that also has great ability, great skill, great belief in itself. But I mean, how did it turn itself around that much? How did it go from, lifting 250 million people out of poverty, highways and roads that are much better than anything in Europe, much faster, trains that, go at speeds that are almost as fast as aeroplanes, huge, entire, like, factories the size of cities. I mean, not cities, but towns. I mean, this is just something that's a bit mind-boggling. Like, just, how did that happen?
I know, it's a most extraordinary story. It really is. I think you capture it very well in what you just said, actually. I mean, if you go to China now, I've said this for a long time to people. I said, when you go to China, or if you go to China, you'll never, ever see the world in the same way again. Never. Because the Western mind always has the West at the center of it. And you go to China and you realize that actually we're not the center of the world anymore. The center of the world is somewhere around here. I mean, China's modernity now is well in advance, in my view, of anything in the West. Anything. But, this extraordinary innovation across such a wide, it's throwing up new companies all the time. Where there were none, there are now, larger and larger, more and more companies with extraordinary capacities for innovation. So how did this happen? I mean, I think one of the important things to understand about China is that, well, first of all, it's got an extraordinarily competent leadership. I mean, Chinese governance is hugely more advanced than what you get in America or what you get in Europe. They know how to run things. I mean, they're not a bunch of lawyers who are running the show, which is the kind of leaders we get here.
We used to get lawyers. Now we get people who are just trying to get votes and do funny stuff. And
but in China, if you look at the standing committee, quite a proportion of them were educated at Tsinghua University as engineers, as scientists. So they know how things work. And the way the Communist Party works, I mean, the Communist Party is a very interesting organization, which you must take seriously and not just, wallow in a sea of prejudice against it because what happened before, which we don't like or didn't like. The way, if you look at Xi Jinping's career, he's run, he started off running, being a leading figure in some, I can't remember all the stages, but in a small town, and then eventually in a province. So he's got 40 years experience or something of knowing how to run things. I mean, what does Keir Starmer know about running anything? And so we've got this kind of system of governance here where, we have allowed people to become the leaders who are supposed to run the country, and they don't have any experience of running anything particularly. So I think that professionalization of leadership and governance is very important to what's happened in China. And so I'd say, look, no, I'm not going to argue for a moment that we should have the Chinese governance system here, because it's impossible. It's a totally different history. But we need to learn from them. That is very important. Learn the best things. But if you keep pushing it away and being negative about it, well, you don't learn anything in that fashion. I think that that another aspect of this process that you're talking about is that the innovative capacity of China over this historical period, especially since 1978 and on, has been that innovative impulse is not just the people who invent things or the people who run companies or the people who run the state. It's much deeper than that. Look, if your economy is growing at 10% a year from 1978 until 2012, it means the economy is doubling in size every 7 years. It means living standards have basically kept pace with it. The living standards have been transformed. So living standards are doubling every 7 years. And if you think of a family, the families, think of the generational gaps between the grandparents, the parents, and the kids. I mean, their experiences are very different societies. Education, schools, hospitals, all of these institutions are being transformed in the same kind of way. So there's a kind of, there's a comprehensive modernization taking place. Who's doing it? The people are doing it. The people are transformed by this process. They're not external to it. They're absolutely bound up in it. And so what you've got is you've got a very, really, basically, a very educated and sophisticated population as a result of all these changes. It's all happening over there, outside the people. The people are being transformed by it. If you look at, by the way, if you look at the people who are running the companies or even the state and so on, they don't come from posh backgrounds. There is an element of that, but most of them, have been transformed by this process, and they become, they become leaders and so on.
Okay, I mean, when you hear China being spoken about on Western channels or on Western media, the big thing is this is a one-party state, lack of freedom of expression, no human rights or less human rights. What is true about that, and what is, I wouldn't say untrue, but what becomes untrue because it's not explained properly?
I think that it's very different from here. I think that we've been brought up in such a different tradition. There's always been, in a way, China's always been a one-party system ever since 2,000 years ago, because the imperial age was essentially then it was the imperial regime, which was the party, if you like. And so that's the tradition over 2,000 years, is that. I mean, Francis Fukuyama makes a good point in one of his books. He said, I can't think of another country in the world where the tradition of governance displays such a powerful continuity as it does in China. So it's what China is. China's never going to be westernized in that same way as we are, because it just 2,000 years is a hell of a long time to be acquiring trying tradition and practicing those traditions and so on. So I think that but likewise the Chinese don't expect other countries to be like it. I mean, it's not like the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the Communist Party of Britain in 1935 produced a program called For a Soviet Britain, And that was the mentality of the Soviet Union. But the Chinese aren't like that at all. The Chinese...
But they weren't like that 2,000 years ago as well. I mean, they were not trying to impose their way and their values.
Correct.
Maybe they were trying to win victories and maybe they had imperial policies, but they weren't looking at the outsiders saying, become like us. They were like, you will become a subordinate to our partners, but become yourself.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at that's a very good point. I mean, if you go back to the tributary system, which was the sort of, if you like, China's world system, i.e. within its region, world equals a region then, it did not interfere with the governance of the tribute states. I mean, the only requirement really it had was to accept that the emperor, the Chinese emperor, was the son of heaven, and that Chinese culture, Chinese thinking, Confucius and so on were, the great thinkers. It didn't make any political. It had no political requirements.
I mean, that is political.
It is political, of course.
I mean, it's almost like that like the son of heaven thing now. I mean, it's almost like that now, because when I do speak, I spoke to a few Chinese people on the podcast. One person in particular, I forget his name now. But even when I hear their response in the media, it's also like they treat one China almost like that kind of thing. It's like when you push back on Tibet, it's like, we're fine with the Tibet as long as, and then they must believe in one China. It's the same with, so it's almost like you can do what you like, except this major big political thing. And when you do that, then you're fine.
Yeah, when you're part of China.
Yes.
Yeah, true. They definitely got their red lines. The point I'm trying to make is that China is not interested in regime change. It doesn't believe in it. It doesn't. Why? Because I think China thinks of itself as the Middle Kingdom. That historically is how it saw itself. So nowhere could be like China, because only China could be like China. It was a sense of achievement and, in some senses, superiority, I think, in the attitude. And to this day, they don't want to interfere. I mean, it won't be like the British and American tradition, the colonial tradition, and then the American tradition, especially since 1945. I mean, they're not interested in that. They're interested. Very important to the Chinese is the economy and trading. I mean, this is what they're brilliant at historically over a very long period of time. Is that.
It seems like,
there's a very powerful. The other thing I'd say is a very powerful work tradition in China. They're very hard workers. The Chinese are.
Okay, I mean, I want to start getting to the Belt and Road Initiative and how China is sort of building a business-friendly empire that helps them center themselves in a way, but also possibly has. I mean, we want to talk about whether those spin-offs for other nations are positive or negative and in which way. But before that, I mean, just to reflect over what you said, it sounds a lot like, I think, Western identity of greatness or of being efficient comes from a colonial idea of expansionism, and comes from subjugating other people, and comes from an idea that we are better and superior, which aided the colonial project. America obviously took on that mantle. I think MAGA in some way now, still the new MAGA movement, which is becoming, less interested in instigating foreign wars or anything else, still sees its supremacy, but is maybe becoming inward. But I think China is older than that. It never had that expansion. I mean, it had an imperial sense, but it was always about, we want to be China, as you said. So whereas if you're in Western Empire, we need to have the more power we can project on the rest of the world, the greater we are. But with the China, it's the more we can be true to who we are and be efficient and great as our Chinese kingdom, the better. And in that process, what happens to the rest of the world is not none of their business, but it's like we will work with the rest of the world in that. Maybe that's how, if I'm trying to understand it. But now, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. So China.
By the way, I agree with the way you put it.
Okay. Good. So I'm learning over here. So China are basically, they're building a lot of infrastructure on land and in ports, I would say, in various parts of Africa and in mainland Asia, or at least the southern part of Asia, connecting trade routes with its neighbors and other countries, putting a lot of investment. Because when I first heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, it seemed like it was this infrastructure project. But now I've come to know that it's a much bigger project. It's about opening up highways and ports in the world, so that and almost providing the seed money for infrastructure with obviously leverage, and but what's at the heart of the Belt and Road Initiative? Its critics say that it's a form of soft imperialism, It's a way of, almost, I mean, I don't think it's colonization in the Western sense where people were enslaved and languages were erased. I don't think it's that. But they say it's a form of neocolonialism, etc. What's your response to that? What do you think it is? Tell us what it is, and then tell us also what you think, are the problems with the critiques of it, or maybe the criticisms are correct.
Yeah. Well, I think that Belt and Road, when it was first announced in 2012-13, no one could work out what the hell it was. There were two major speeches that she gave, one in Kazakhstan and one in Indonesia, and I think the idea, as presented initially, was that, look, China's grown. It was directed at the developing world. It was not directed in any serious way, except at the edges, towards the Western world. And the idea was that, look, we've managed to grow and transform our economy and raise living standards and the role of the state's been important and so on. So it was really a development program for the developing world, based on Chinese experience. I think actually only China could have thought of something like this, because it's extraordinary. There's 146 to 150 countries part of Belt and Road. I mean, it's an extraordinary global enterprise. I mean, it embraces the majority of humanity now, because there's only 190 odd countries in the world. And I think that, it speaks to the historic achievement of China, being able to take on extraordinarily big projects, whether it was the Great Wall or whether it was the tribute system or what have you. China has this sort of global view. I think it comes from the fact that it was a civilization, and that, you see, initially, this is a very important point, and we haven't discussed it, but China grew up from, this is way before the Qin dynasty and the unification of China. China grew up with a philosophy of Tianxia, everyone under heaven, and I did mention earlier that that China as a civilization, it doesn't have boundaries, natural boundaries. So it was a very interesting Chinese philosopher, Zhao Tingyong, who argued in an article in 2005 that China has essentially a worldview in a way that the West does not have a worldview. China believes in a concept of the world. The West doesn't really. The West believes in the concept of nation states, as you can see, in the United Nations. I mean, the nearest we get to a world thing is the United Nations, but it's based on nation states. So the Chinese view, the Chinese philosophical view, is that China's relationship with the world should be genuinely global, and this is reinforced greatly by the experience of colonization and China's identification with the colonial countries, which is clear, very, very clear after 1949, 1955 and the Bandung Conference and so on. This was central to China's thinking, and Mao was very committed to China's relationship with Africa. He identified with Africa. Of course, at that stage, China was poorer than quite a number of African states after the end of the Second World War. So I think that we have to see Belt and Road in these other, there's various traditions and historical experiences and philosophical conceptions which flow into this notion of Belt and Road and lie behind it, because it's not a natural thing. It's not. There's no model for it, other than perhaps bits of Chinese history. But elsewhere there aren't any things like it. So I think this was the thinking behind it. Obviously that notion has developed a lot with the global south now, as we tend to call it, the developing world, and China. China's foreign relations are first and foremost based on its relationship with the global south. It doesn't think of it beyond the point. It doesn't trust the West.
I can see why.
Yeah.
The West doesn't trust China. No, but I mean, what do you think about specifically that criticism? For example, they'll build a bunch of ports in Sri Lanka, or they'll build a bunch of ports on various African countries on the East Coast or even the Western Coast. And then there's a criticism that, obviously they put down the investment. They usually bring in Chinese workers to an extent to help with that. But then the criticism is now that country is indebted to it. And so China has leverage over them and can impact their policies, their, whatever it may be. What do you? I mean, which is? Is
there some truth in that? Yeah, I think there is some truth in that. But I think that part of it was inevitable in the sense that you want to establish this or that infrastructural project, railway, whatever it is, in a country, and and so obviously a Chinese company does it, because how else are you going to do it? And then you haven't got a labour force that is skilled, has the necessary skills, and so on. So and then the Chinese company feels more comfortable with Chinese workers because they'll follow the disciplines and so on. Yes. So I don't think I think one can understand the reasons for it without saying, well, this is a neo-colonial project. And I think that if you look at what's happened, I mean, so many countries have signed up to Belt and Road. So many countries, with big projects. I mean, so this is a big thing now. The Belt and Road is actually a microcosm of the way the world is moving in terms of a global order. Because the new global order, in my view, that will replace the present global order, the axis of that is going to be China and the global south. Okay. That's going to be this is also, in my view, a great possibility, because historically in the British Empire and the American Empire sort of thing, these were tiny minorities running the world. But if there is a genuine possibility, which I think there is, of a global order based in the first instance on China and the global south, that's 85% of the world's population. So one can imagine a majority, the first majoritarian global order. I'm not going to say that it'll be perfect. I'm not going to say there's nothing wrong with it. But historically speaking, it will be a great advance on what's happened in the past.
Okay. I want to discuss the future more. I want to discuss Donald Trump, and I want to discuss potentially India, which has a fractious relationship with China at best. But before that, I mean, when I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I think a lot of people listening to would agree with a lot of what you've said, would understand that. I think increasingly China gets soft love from people, in the sense that they may still, decry China or worry about it, but they kind of admire it. They admire its advancement. They admire the fact that it has all these interesting EVs, which cost a third of what Western cars cost, and are just as good. I mean, in terms of their features, at least, we don't yet know about how their engines will perform in 10 years, because they've only been on our streets for 3 or 4 years. But I mean, when it comes to the issue of human rights, right now, the West has lost a lot of credibility, honestly, over 400 years on human rights. But specifically, I think it's been very visible in the last 2 or 3 years, right? But I mean, it's not a new thing. If you go back to the war in Iraq, if you go back to Vietnam, if you go back to the war on Korea, Western, people were struggling in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for racial equality, and there's still lots of racism in the West. So I mean, there's lots of issues. But besides those issues, it seems like there are valid concerns about scapegoating China for a lot of other things, right? Locking up dissenters. I mean, there's lots of reports from very credible organizations that I've relied on as a journalist and see as credible, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, about the awful, internment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I mean, in my reporting career, I've met people who are Uyghur who have told me horrifying stories about their relatives going missing. The fact that they are overseas themselves, and that they are there already is jeopardy for their family, who they can't contact anymore. So it's a weird thing, because even I'm sitting here listening to you, and I want to be a fan of China, right? But then I'm like, but there's all these horrible things going on. How do I put the two together?
Well, the question you've raised particularly is Xinjiang.
I mean, it's that, mainly, yes.
I mean, I think that generally it's a kind of, China's a pretty, very law-abiding but lawful society as well. It's not that people are locked up on the basis of nothing and so on. It's a very sophisticated society now in China, and when people are talking about it, it feels like they're talking about the Cultural Revolution or some period like that, when there were a lot of arbitrary arrests and so on. Now, I think it's a much more lawful society now as it's developed and as it's become more and more educated and so on. And as it's become more aware of the importance of its own reputation internationally, I think that's another factor that's been shaping the way China reacts and deals with things. So I think that the question of human rights is used in a very wide way. I mean, I'll come to Xinjiang because it's important, but what are the rights of people in China compared with the rights of people in the West? Education, they've got an excellent education system. In many ways, probably better than here for everyone, or the vast majority. Attitude towards poverty. They've taken actually 800 million people out of poverty since 1978, including, and there must be the only country in the world that, to get rid of extreme poverty in that campaign a few years ago, which required extraordinary amounts of investment to try and take people out of poverty. So in the rural areas, they're still poor, of course, but they're not as poor as they were. Can you imagine that happening in the United States or here? I don't think so. I mean, actually what's happened is that in the period of the last 30, 40 years, inequalities have worsened, and there have been no really major positive steps to try and intervene in that process and help those who are the least fortunate. Geographical areas have fallen behind. It's the expectation of life in Glasgow compared with London, 10 years difference. So I think that's a very important aspect of human rights, which the Chinese have been very proactive about. Now, when it comes to politics, look, definitely the lines of what's acceptable are drawn much more narrowly than here, in a way that we British people would not, I think, tolerate or would not like. And under Xi, it's probably got worse. Although I personally, I've come to opinion, actually, I didn't have this so strongly, but Xi's been a remarkable leader for China, actually. But early on, that this it would definitely became more restrictive in terms of what people could say and write and get published and so on. Having said that, of course, the internet has opened up, like something like Weibo, which is like their sort of version of Twitter. It's very, very argumentative. And
what can I say on Weibo and what couldn't I say? For example, I mean, I've never been on Weibo. Most of our listeners or people watching this would never have been on Weibo. So, to give us a sense of just how restrictive or non-restrictive it is, I'm guessing I can't say anything about Xi, but can I and I can't say anything probably in defense of Xinjiang or Tibet, but what can I say and what can't I say?
Well, I think that I don't remember now what about apologies, but about Xinjiang and what was on Weibo and what wasn't. So I could only talk in more general terms, really, which is that I think that there's a lot of controversies in China, a lot of arguments about the internet, about social media, about what's another good example? I mean, the big social issues. I mean, there is a very, very, it's a sophisticated society with a lot of educated, sophisticated people who've got ideas and thoughts. And so the idea that they can't say anything about anything particularly, that is complete nonsense. I think it's just wrong. But if you wanted to argue, you see, it's a society which, if you say, can you argue for the creation of another political party or something like that? I doubt it, but I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest with you, is where the limits would be drawn. I mean, my own experience was of Weibo, because I contribute to Weibo, or used to, I'm not doing it at the moment particularly, but the only time I had one piece not was taken down, or I can't remember what it was about, but I remember another piece where it got changed because you're not allowed to mention Xi Jinping's name. You can say the leader or the various ways, but you're not allowed to say
even if it's praise.
Yeah, no,
okay,
at all, because it was the way I referred to it was not negative, but yeah. But it was just like sensibilities,
Yes,
It's about China's got its own notions of, honor and, what's the word? Codes about what you can say, just like we have, and so I mean, it definitely. The universities have become more restricted during this last.
In what way? Like how? Give me an example.
Well, I think the range of lecturers at universities who you're invited to speak, it's become more controlled. I don't agree with that. I think that's negative, definitely. And so one of the problems that happened was that in the last years of the Hu Jintao era, which was 2002 to 2012, there was a lot of corruption, and the corruption was growing, and it was particularly, obviously, within the public sector with civil servants and the party, Communist Party. And people were losing some faith, I think, in they resented the fact that people were getting on because and getting rich or getting promoted, and enjoying the benefits of corruption and so on. So when Xi came in, one of his first big things, maybe the first big thing, was an attack on corruption. And it was very, very strict. So now people in public office, there were very strict limits on how much they could earn, what else they could do, whether they could accept gifts, all those kind of things. So it became very sort of puritanical, if you like, compared with what it's been. But the problem was that actually, this is a very important thing which didn't get reported nearly enough here, but this was a very important political struggle over, the standards and the values and so on that that governance had to embrace, and there was a strong view that it was kind of corroding society and corroding society. I think there was no question that this was true. This was happening, and there was a big many more controls were instituted to stop this, and in the process, I think it went into areas where it shouldn't have gone into, But I mean, I think this is a much more complicated question than the way we normally discuss it. I mean, China's incredibly innovative, incredibly inventive, and people now remember the old Western line used to be, well, China can never become a modernized, a leading modernized economy, because it was a communist state and didn't allow discussion and didn't allow debate. And what's happened is that it has become that, and there is clearly there is a lot of discussion and debate in China, but it's just different. I think if you were British and you were living in China and you spoke Chinese and so on, you'd find it difficult to adapt to that, but not impossible, because you'd start, you'd see the logic of it and become to, if ultimately, I suppose, respect it, but or become. So anyway, I'm blathering along there. So
yeah, okay, but I mean, coming back to Xinjiang, which you said you will get to,
yeah. Sorry. Well, I find it very hard to get to the bottom of the Xinjiang. I've been to Xinjiang once, just once, to Urumqi. And I think that the trouble with the situation in, I think that the Chinese made some serious mistakes. One was to allow far too much Han emigration into Xinjiang. With the result, it's much higher than, for example, what happened in Tibet. Tibet's still low Han population as a proportion.
But was that intentional? I mean, the allowing of.
I think what happens is that, I think some of it's intentional. Chinese firms recruit Han, and some of it is unintentional in that
yes.
Han. Like
and are seeking opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Like any migration, even internal migration. A bit when I'm going to leave the northeast because I want opportunities. I'll go down there. And I think that what happened definitely, and the Chinese are very, very entrepreneurial. I mean, I said earlier, they're very hard work. They're very entrepreneurial. They're very good at it. They're absolutely natural at it. It's obviously absolutely centuries of.
I mean just in.
So they go. So then they become wealthy, because the Uyghur were basically in the poorer areas, near the oases and so on, but it were essentially they until a generation or two ago were partly nomadic. So they came from, a much, and they didn't have the networks with the rest of China that the Han would have in Xinjiang. So there was a growing sense of resentment amongst the Uyghur towards the Han. Too many.
Okay, but how does that then result in internment camps and suppression of their identity and people being?
Well, I think that it led to the situation led to friction. I mean, we have to go back a bit here. We have to go back to, was it 2009, when there was a pogrom by Uyghur in Urumqi, resulting in quite a few Han deaths. And immediately afterwards, the Han. There was a big Han demonstration. So you have a bit of a powder keg here between the two. So now to deal, and you had the development of more anti. Well, I don't know what terms to use for this, but you had more hostility towards the Han and towards Chinese things amongst the Uyghur population, and so this was repressed. I mean, when I went to Urumqi, it was, on the face of it, everything was quite calm and so on. This was 2015, I think it was, and then there was nothing particularly odd. And in the hotel where I was staying, they had scanners, but no one was operating the scanners, so it felt like quite laid back. But if you went to another area, then you'd suddenly see, a police van, which was a kind of militarized police van, and a whole load of police, obviously to deal with what? There's obviously a problem of terrorism in I'll tell you what it reminded me. It reminded me a bit of the troubles in Northern Ireland. That's the nearest.
But I mean, I think terrorism is a bit of a scapegoat. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to say that there are never acts of violence by the Uyghurs, but it's. I mean, I haven't been to Xinjiang, but I have been to Kashmir, and what you're saying, it sounds a lot like Kashmir, where obviously there's acts of violence because Kashmiris are upset that they are being marginalized, that they are being suppressed.
Yeah.
But the solution to that isn't, stricter checkpoints and more militarization. And, I mean, the police presence there incites a reaction. It incites violence. It incites, and is a form of uprooting. It not necessarily. I mean, in Kashmir, it's seen by the locals as occupation. In Xinjiang, probably it's not occupation, but it's seen as a sense of control of who they are.
Yeah.
And how, and it's just, it's
Yeah,
not, it's definitely not the way you manage the problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you're right. At the end of the day, you can't solve a problem like that by repression.
Yes.
You have to listen to what their grievances are.
But I mean, I don't think and the thing is, so I think it's clear that there isn't a lot of that happening. There isn't a lot of dialogue. There's a lot more suppression or control, right, occurring.
Yeah. Well, I think that the situation has gone through different phases. So there was a phase after the pogroms and so on, where I think they tried to, I can't remember the historical phase now, but they tried to, there was a phase of repression, and then from about 2012 to 2010, I can't remember, 2010 to 2014, something like that, there was a more liberal regime introduced. And the violence and so on got worse. And so they then, about 2015-16, they put another guy in running the show. This is the key job is a party job, not the state job, and the party job is always Han, never Uyghur. The head of the government might be Uyghur, but the real power lies with the party in that situation. And they, and then there was, they obviously the guy that they came in had a very repressive view, and I think that's when you got this new.
Yeah, but obviously the guy who came in was backed by Beijing.
Oh yeah, no, he's appointed by Beijing.
Exactly,
I mean,
yeah.
absolutely, it's very important. I mean, the Chinese are nervous about this. I mean, I remember I was at a conference with lots of international people, and I was one of the ones who could ask a question. It was with the guy speaking was then the vice president, and I asked my question was about Xinjiang, and I asked could you give report, I asked a succinct question, and the only question that never was never replied to was my question. They just didn't want to talk about it, and I think that I think it's a very big problem for them. Which
do you think they see it as a big problem? I've when I'm having
yes, I do. I think they have because one of the things that really strikes me over the last several years is huge amounts of money they've been putting into Xinjiang. I mean, it's the fastest growing province and has been for some time now.
But I mean, the thing is, how are they planning to deal with the situation? Are they hoping it goes away? Are they hoping what's their? I mean, what I don't understand from the state is it seems like this is a very efficient state. Fair enough, they have a different culture in terms of freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Right. Very different culture in terms of leadership. I can get all of that stuff. But the Xinjiang thing, and I mean, it's other things too. But I mean, I think the Xinjiang, let's just focus on that because it's like sort of the key case study that exemplifies all of these issues. It's like, as a very smart, efficient nation and government, you surely see a more intelligent way to deal with this problem than repression. And you don't seem to be letting up. And it's a publicity problem, it's an efficiency problem, it's an immoral thing. So, like, I don't understand it. Why are they pursuing this policy?
I think that, it's a good question. Very, very, very good question. A fair question. I think that, I suppose we need to stand back and ask a question about ethnic diversity in China. And China is obviously China is the product of many, many different races over time. And yet today, something like 94% of the population would describe themselves as Han. Han actually is not Han is not actually a racial category, but that's how it evolved from the 19th century. And so there is, and you can see if you go to China, there's a lot of ethnic diversity. But by and they recognise ethnic diversity because that was part of what they did after 1949. There was 54 ethnic groups, and this, whereas previously under Chiang Kai-shek and before that there was no ethnic diversity, no recognition of it. So that was an advance. I think that what's happened historically with the development of China is that ethnic diversity has weakened with the process of, there has been a kind of process of Hanization, if you like. So
a state process, a state project.
Well, whether it's a state, there's an element of this. The state's involved in it, but also it's as a popular level. I think that what happened. Take the Manchu, the Qing dynasty. Two of the last three dynasties in China were non-Han. One was the Manchurians from the northeast, and that dynasty lasted from the mid-17th century till 1911. Then there was the Ming dynasty, which was before that, which was a Han dynasty, and lasted about 200 or 300 years. And then before that, for 100 years, you got the Yuan dynasty, which was Mongolian, and which was very different in lots of ways, and was part of drawn from the steppes and so on. Somehow one has to try and understand China's attitude towards ethnicity and how it operates and how it works in the context of this kind of historical tradition. So if you take, it's not a Muslim problem, particularly because the Uyghur are the second biggest Muslim group in China. The biggest are the Hui, and they are very integrated, but they come from historically different geographical regions from where the Uyghur came from. So they're very integrated and very successful by and large. But the Uyghur have not been successful. And I think that, also the Chinese mentality is very much an urban mentality. And cities. They live in cities. They go to cities. You see, including in terms of global migration. So I think that that there's an element of prejudice involved in that. There's obviously a multi-layered sources of prejudice amongst the Han.
Yes.
In Xinjiang, for example, and they look down on the Uyghur, and the Uyghur resent that quite rightly. Quite understandably. So I'm trying to build up more of a picture. I think that was a colossal wrong move to whatever they were doing in those. They've been described as kind of semi-prisons. I don't buy that. But
I think I don't know, but I think that I don't not buy that some of the conditions in some of those camps at times were really, really bad. And then there's not just the camps, there's the infrastructure around the camps. The fact that people are taken, no one knows where they are. There's the atmosphere of you can't speak. There's the atmosphere of if you have.
We haven't had that kind of coverage recently, have we? Not
no, I don't think it just disappears. I don't think systems of power that oppress you just go away overnight.
No.
Yes.
That was an extreme form.
Yes. No, but there's still many people, many Uyghurs who are living in London or in other parts of the West who still aren't in contact with their family, don't know where they are. So it's ongoing. It's not that
there's an ongoing problem.
Yes.
It's been going on since the 1930s. It goes back a long time. The particular problem, I think, for the Chinese is, point you alluded to earlier, was this notion of unity of the country. And the problem, the Uyghurs, a section of the Uyghurs think they should be independent from China.
No, I do think,
and I think that is a problem for
there's
the
this
Chinese.
Han monoculture. It's like there's a move to kind of have a monoculture of sorts in China, which I think feeds into it, which I think is both a state project, and I could be wrong here, so please correct me, but also I think it's aspirational for the people. So many people who are possibly more ethnically diverse than Han now want to be associated with Han because it's being associated with the China that's on the rise, this new rising dynasty, sort of.
If you take Manchuria, the decline of people who speak in Manchu, it's obviously partly because they want to be associated with this new urban society,
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's some of the things happening in India now, where people are excited about the state's prosperity, and so they're adopting Hindu nationalism as part of their identity, not because they necessarily love Hindu nationalism, but because they see it as a conduit of India's new success. Okay, so now probably the crux of, the main part of why we're having this conversation, which is the future, and U.S. decline seems to be occurring. I think it's a relative to every other. Some would say no. Some would say the USA is still really amazing. It's got the 7 biggest companies in the world, strongest military in the world. Donald Trump is a manifestation of that greatness because he just goes and kidnaps presidents and other people will see the complete opposite. They'll say that the economy is in decline. Its relative strength to the world is in decline. Its relative military strength to the world is in decline. You obviously, I'm assuming, take the view that the US is massively in decline and China has already eclipsed it or about to eclipse it in many ways. How is the world going to change in the next 20, 30 years based on the rise of China and the decline of the US? And where do you see US power sort of working itself out, US-China power working itself out in the future?
Well, I think that talking about where things are now, there's no question, looking at the statistics and so that relatively speaking, China's been on the rise and the United States has been in decline. And the significance of Trump and the rise of Trump was that he gave voice to that unease in American society. The conditions of many working class Americans had been declining or over quite a long time or stagnating. And people were increasingly frustrated by and let down by the American presidencies. So what Trump was articulated the anger towards and fear of China, which had not really been articulated except in traditional ways in the US at that point. And he's really, in so doing, he's, I think, recreated or redefined the American political stage in a very profound way. He's America. So a number of points one might draw from that. First of all, American democracy is under significant challenge, I think. The role of, Trump himself is a sort of neo-autocrat, if you like, the way he operates. He's ruled essentially by edict and completely bypassed Congress. So America is changing in a very, the way in which the government sent in ICE people to essentially attack migrant communities or weaken them or banish them from the country. So America's, and meanwhile, America has, in a way, with the whole tariff regime, recognized the weakness of the American economy as a competitive unit in the world and introduced tariffs as a means to try and readjust that situation. I think that Trump marks globally a retreat in that he talks about the Western Hemisphere. Well, there are two elements to this, if you like. He talks about the Western Hemisphere. He doesn't. Greater America is Greater America within the context of the Western Hemisphere. Greenland, for example, is talked about in that context. Now that's a significant retreat from China, from the United States as the global hegemon, because previously the question was, international order, United States as the leader of the international order, and so on. Now, Trump is talking in hemispheric terms rather than global terms. I think the other element of this is his attitude towards China. Now, for Trump, the real enemy is China. But he has been unable. He in the clashes he's had with China, each stage he's been forced to retreat. In April, and then more recently, and the reason is because of the rare metals threat and so on. So China's too strong now for America. So Trump would like to do, but can't do he'd like to roll back China in some way, and that's how it all started. I think when he came in 2016, that's what he thought he could do, and they can't do it, and they won't be able to do it because the situation's getting worse all the time.
Worse for the Americans.
Worse for the Americans, yeah. Sorry, and China's getting stronger. And China China thinks strategically. So after the first, I think the Chinese learnt a lot from the first term. The first term, they weren't really prepared for it. They'd never seen anyone like Trump before. They'd had the American leaders they're dealing with ever since Nixon in 1972 had been relatively they've been part of a certain liberal America, which we're familiar with. And then along comes Trump, who's a totally different kettle of fish, someone we haven't seen in modern times as American leader. And the Chinese were, because they'd cooperated with America ever since 1972, they had a relatively benign view. I mean, they knew it was competition and all that, but they didn't think of America as the enemy, and they were grateful. They learned from America, blah blah blah. All the technology and so on. And now I think what happened is they learned that that America could not be trusted. Now, in the Communist Party leadership, ever since Jiang Zemin, there'd been a view that China just had a certain period of development like they were having before America
tries to put a stop to it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, of course, what happened. But when it actually happened, I don't think they were really prepared for it. But they realize now exactly that America couldn't be trusted. And they prepared meticulously for the return of someone like Trump. Actually, it was Trump 2.0. And if you look at, one of the most interesting and graphic examples is the Chinese just greatly reduced their dependence on the American market. Between 2016 and 2024, the Chinese reduced the significance of Chinese exports to the Chinese American market from, I think it was 20% down to 13%. That's a big reduction in a very short space of time. So they were just a emphasis on self-dependence and so on. And then, if you look now, they were in difficulties in the Biden period over chips and so on, because China was well behind America at that point, America and Netherlands and Taiwan, and so, the Chinese knew which industries they had to develop, knew which components they needed to be able to compete in, and now they're still behind in chips, but not very far behind. Actually, Jason Huang, from NVIDIA, is right about. He's absolutely right that if you do what you're doing, then you're just going to create. China's just going to develop a very competitive and large computer industry, which will outcompete us, and that's in the process of what's happening. And AI. China was significantly behind, but I don't think it is. I think if you look, reading the commentators at the moment in Financial Times and other places, there's a general view that probably China is, more or less on a par, in some ways ahead. They got ahead. Remember last January, a year ago, when DeepSeek, open source. Open source is Belt and Road. The way the Americans do it, no, they can't afford. They can't afford to buy AI, but they can open source. Well, it enables all sorts of people to use it.
Okay, I want to just have a comment, and then I'll have a final question to this. I think the comment is that, and I want your reflection, your response to the comment, and then the final question. So, I think you see Trump, in my view. I think the key here is that he's not strategic, and I think America, if they were really interested in ensuring that China doesn't become a rival to them, they should have been much more smart about identifying that in about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
But they were caught up in a bunch of silly wars, which are very identitarian in the Middle East and other parts, and their foreign policy. I think they just underestimated China. They were like these, which is a racist view as well. These guys will never.
It is a racist.
Yes, these guys will never actually compete with us until they suddenly had better goods and everything else. But I think the other thing is that Trump's going about then trying to have this war on China, but instead of isolating China, he's isolating the US. So he's not trying to build strong alliances with Europe and other partners to say, hey, we're in a problem here. there's this massive Chinese state civilization that's going to come and, destroy us all. Not that that's true at any stretch of the imagination, but or even, or that's a threat to our economic dominance. It's a threat to our cultural dominance. He's isolating the Europeans. He's isolating because he's fighting everyone.
Yeah.
Right. Which is it's a mixture of stupidity and bravado, and it is bound to fail. Right. But the thing is, I'm guessing that instinct will self-correct at some point, if not in Trump, but in the U.S. administration. And if Europe has some, and they do have a skin in the game, then so do you see some sort of future before we get to, the final question, which was how is this going to change the whole world? But do you see some future in maybe 4 years or 6 years or 10 years where the Europeans and Americans and others who feel the threat from China's dominance, either economically or culturally or any other way, militarily, for example, do you see them working together in a more constructive, strategic way for some future?
What, the West?
Yes, the West.
I think the West is in big trouble. I think probably with Trump. I mean, a lot of what you said with Trump, I agree. I think that with Trump, America's definitely, it's not just Trump. Trump's reflecting a groundswell of opinion in the United States that, which is a return to the past, really, America on its own, prior to the First World War, America wouldn't have been bound up with all these international organizations and all that kind of thing. So
but it also just wasn't the same country that it was. I mean, it was a rising power, etc. But it just wasn't what it, the rest of the world had colonies and America had itself.
Yeah.
Back then.
But America was, it was America alone. And this is what, Trump
yes.
Trump believes. This is what Trump believes. He believes everyone else is inferior. If the Europeans won't do our bidding, then we'll kick them into touch and so on. I mean, so I think that I think that we don't know the answer to these questions because they lie in the future. But I think that I think basically the West, as we've known it, is over. And that
over.
It's
changing.
That idea of the Atlantic Alliance and so on, that is going to weaken, I think.
So you don't think it'll strengthen after like a initial weakening because they'll realize?
Well, it could do. That is a possibility. I think we're in the land of the unknown here. Because obviously there's going to be a lot of changes in Europe as well. I mean, we haven't really seen Europe has just been sort of doing two things: moving to the right, or the rise of the far right, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to appease America and with Trump, and that's been its preoccupation. And then there are now strong voices. Well, we've got to stand up to America. We can't allow Greenland, etc., and all that. Stum made a mistake. Europe made a mistake in not responding to the tariff threat a year ago in the way that it should have done that from April 2025 onwards. So I think that my feeling is that it will be very difficult to put that to get back together again. Now, then there's another aspect to this, which when you talk about alliances, it's not just America and Europe, it's America and, for example, South Korea bases, Japan bases, Taiwan. Now, I think in this situation, Japan is a problem of its own and its own making. But South Korea, I think, isn't going to go with America. I mean,
it's true. It can pivot, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to play it both ways, but it's probably going to lean more and more towards China.
Yeah, even unintentionally, but it will.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And Taiwan is going to become part of China. I think that is absolutely inevitable.
Do you mean like in a more soft way, or do you mean in a hard way?
I think that China's shown enormous patience. I don't know whether there's a quote in Kissinger's book on China, where he quotes Mao. And Mao is, I think Mao said something like, Taiwan, it's just an island. We can wait 100 years or something like that. Very long time scale. Very, and I think that the Chinese can be very patient because Taiwan is, there are signs of a new political movement anyway in Taiwan, which is more sympathetic towards China. The new leader of the KMT is someone...
Which is part of waiting for 100 years. That will happen.
Yeah. But they'll keep the pressure up, as you can see. And if... I've never really gone with the idea that she will, in 2027 or is going to invade Taiwan. I don't think
it makes strategic sense for them.
It doesn't
it makes the more strategic position is to wait.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And now, the world, and China's playing a really good, China's really got it right now. It doesn't react to all this stuff going on. It's just quiet self-assurance and reassurance that she and, we're getting on with the job. We're modernizing China. We're supplying you with electric vehicles. We're the global leader in green technology. We're about to reduce our CO2 emissions massively over the next 20 years. So I think that we are the responsible global leader. I think that's what the China's doing. So I don't think they'd want to invade Taiwan at all. And when I'm in, I got quite well connected in China, and I don't hear them talking about Taiwan in a threat. So I think that the world is America's losing its position. I think the global order, as we've known it, we've grown up with it since 1945, is broken, and it won't be possible to put it together again. And that's a problem because the Chinese actually are supportive of the present global order with reforms. That's their position, whereas Trump seems to be basically against it. So I think that I think the question will be can Europe come to terms with a different relationship with China? I mean, the big problem the Europeans have got is basically arrogance, I think, towards China. They think that they thought they were superior, that they didn't believe in the rise of China, they wouldn't be able to compete with the top European firms, blah, blah, blah. And look what happens. The biggest, most important industry in Europe is the car industry, and the Chinese have taken them to the cleaners because they were smug, complacent, thought it could never happen. So they're in, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, all these firms are in big trouble. Who would have thought that? That is just an example of what is happening. So the Europeans, if you go back to 1978, 1980, the Germans were very far-sighted. Volkswagen was very far-sighted. The Chinese wanted to Western investment, European investment. So I think Volkswagen built its first plant in China in 1982. That's a hell of a long time ago. So they were they dominated the roads. I mean, I'm interested in cars, and I was always frustrated that there were the Chinese models just didn't sell compared with the Western models. But so what's happened now is, why did the Chinese want European firms in the first place? Because they wanted the investment they needed to learn. They needed the technology. Now, what's happened? It's the European firms that need the technology, that need the know-how of the Chinese firm. It's a complete inversion in the relationship. From being inferior, they're on top. Now, how is Europe going to come to terms with all that?
Okay.
Now, by the way, the other thing is, in the longer run, about America is, because this is too long, but at some point there'll be a calculation in America that getting on with China is better and more profitable than falling out with them and having these big arguments. That at some point, America will have to accept a fundamental fundamentally different relationship with China, just like Europe has got to do.
I mean, I think when if that happens, and when it happens, it's almost by then they will settle for being the not hegemon. They'll just realize.
Exactly.
I mean, because usually that's when you settle, when you have to settle because you don't have
You
the
can't do
power
it.
anymore. Yes, when you have the power, you feel you can do anything.
Absolutely.
You punch and shout and scream and kidnap presidents. Final question, and I mean, you can answer it in stages, so it may not be the final question, but just how is, I mean, I think I do agree with you that I think in the 20 or 30 year trajectory, or even shorter, China's relative strength will increase, and the US, I mean, they do have a problem with the remnants of the one-child policy, where China's population is going to start declining for a long period, and that's definitely going to impact their ability to grow. But I mean, I think they will still, because, I mean, they are still going to grow on the whole. I mean, I'm not sure what the longer trajectory is because of that particular policy, but just maybe respond to that. But it's clear that China is, it's making, as you've said, it's making an alliance, infrastructure alliance, a trading alliance with the global South. Who needs it? Because the global South is also mistrustful of the West. And the only actors that are still dealing with the West, I think, in the global South are countries that, or either run by people who want a profitable relationship with the West, or almost, invariably there are countries in the global South that have a genuine profitable relationship with the West, but a lot of them do it because, there's a form of coercion that has its history with corporations that were set up by colonial entities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they look at China with a bit of suspicion maybe, but increasingly also with a bit of relief. There's someone else we can go to. There's someone else we can trade with. I know with South Africa, for example, when there's, as the US are putting on tariffs and restrictions that may or may not be related to South Africa's genocide case against Israel, the South African members of government and others say, oh, it's okay, we can go to China now, right? So there's this element of relief. How do you see the global South changing due to the rise of China and the decline of the West?
I think this is the embryo of the future. The future is, at the core of the future is the relationship between China and the global South. And it's actually, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's been a growing phenomenon. Its roots go back to the Second World War and the post-Second World War period and the anti-colonial movement. And China has always had a very positive, empathetic attitude towards the developing world. It identifies with the developing world. It doesn't identify with the West. That doesn't mean it doesn't see anything positive or the importance of getting on with the West, but it doesn't identify with the West. It identifies with the developing world. And so I think that the next period, however long it is, will be a process by which a new global order begins to take shape. And the global order will be structured around China and the global South. I don't mean by that the West won't be a part of it. Everyone will be a part of it. A global order has got to be inclusive. But the big players, the architects of it, will be China and the global South. And a country like India, for example, is very important to this, and the relationship between India and China, which hasn't been great, that's a very important relationship, which I hope can become more friendly in the future. And I think that if I stand back from this period now of what's happening and think of it historically, what is all the unpredictability, the uncertainty, the volatility, the breakdown of relationships, the breakdown of in trading relationships. So what is all that about? Because it is quite extraordinary what's happening, and it's been happening very, very quickly. What is that about? I think what we're witnessing is the end of the era of American dominance.
I mean, maybe even Western dominance.
Well, in American dominance in the first instance, and with the end of American dominance is the end of Western dominance, because there ain't no Western dominance without the United States. because Europe is that much weaker than the United States now. So I think, and this period started, I think, in 2008, looking back on it, with the financial crisis. That was the moment when the citadels of American financial power were shaken. And also the realization in America, and the American elite, and of course the forces like Trump, they realized that China was really a very powerful country already. And ever since then, you've got the rise of Trump, you've got a huge shift in American attitudes, breakdown of the Western alliances, we've seen it, and so on. So there's a fragmentation and sort of disintegration taking place in the Western world. Meanwhile, the developing world is growing much faster than the developed world, and there's a self-confidence, I think, growing in the global south about what the possibilities are. And I agree absolutely with what you said, that China's providing them with a possibility, with an alternative, with a way of developing which they didn't have with the West, because the West was either a colonialist attitude or post-colonialist attitude, which was drawn from the colonial attitude. So I think that now the only historical period we've ever had in the modern period like this was equivalent, was that between 1931 and 1945, which was the end of British hegemony and the rise of America. But there was a very unstable period, as we all know. Maybe you could make it a bit earlier, maybe 1929, when there was great instability, when everything was going, everything was breaking down and so on. Of course, it led to fascism and then the Second World War. And then in 1945, you had the resolution of that by the emergence of the United States as the new hegemon. So I see that as a parallel period to the one we're living in now. The only thing we don't know is, how long this period is going to last. But it's certainly not near any kind of resolution at the moment. I think at least 20 years is my guess, something like that.
Do you think, that the previous period you spoke about, it resulted in a massive war, the biggest war we've ever known? Never mind the biggest war we've ever known. I don't think we'll have something of that sort necessarily. But, do you see a lot of political and military turmoil in this period?
Yeah.
How bad?
Well, the political turmoil, look, we've already... The
political turmoil
is happening now. And the economic turmoil is happening now. The only thing we don't have is military turmoil, although we do have, a war going. We've got the Ukraine situation. We've got Gaza, which was, appalling by the Israelis, and then you've got, the Venezuela and the threat on the Greenland. So that military side is accelerating. Trump posed as a man of peace. I always thought that was baloney. That's just a marketing job, opportunistic marketing job, because he obviously fancies using the military. He likes to use it on anyone, except anyone who can give him a bloody eye, bloody nose. Sorry. So I think that we've not seen the worst of it. I think it's going to get worse. I think the situation's going to get worse. It's going to get more dangerous, I think, from a military aspect. I don't rule out something awful happening. I think that the main deterrent for something awful happening is that China can do to the United States much worse than the United States can do to China. That's a deterrent.
Okay. Martin, Jacques, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.